Welcome to the 20th anniversary celebration of the Winterset and Summer Literary Festival. I'm Noreen Golfman, I'm chair of the festival board. The Winterset and Summer Literary Festival respectfully acknowledges the territory of the Eastport Peninsula on which we gather as the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk. We also acknowledge with respect the diverse histories and cultures of the Beothuk, Mi'kmaq, Innu, and Inuit of this province. This session, as you are soon going to hear and see, honors the nominees and the award winner for 2020. A lively conversation among them is hosted by Jennifer Guy, one of the original founding directors of the Winterset and Summer Literary Festival. Jennifer remains a loyal champion of this festival, and for that we are all very grateful, to put it mildly. Jennifer was a journalist for CBC for 20 years, and then she spent years as an executive director and professional in public affairs and communications. She always brings her well-honed communication skills to Winterset panels, as again, you will see and hear soon. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for hosting this special BMO Winterset 2020 award session with your inimitable grace and charm. And now over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Noreen. And as a longtime Winterset fan and supporter, I want to thank you on behalf of everybody for taking over the role of chair. It's a huge responsibility, and we're blessed that you're giving us your vision, your brilliance, your dedication, and your visionary thinking. Thank you so much. I also want to make a quick thanks to Michael Enright, without whom this Saturday evening session I don't think would be the standard that it has reached, and he's given almost 2 decades to making this work, and I want to thank you, Michael. And also belated thanks to Richard Gwynn, who's left us this year, and his wife Carol for also making this session so wonderful. So thank you all, and it is my absolute pleasure to bring to you this evening, although this is June 24th in the morning, a couple of months ago, the winner and the finalists of the BMO Winterset Award. And the BMO Winterset Award is one of the most prestigious writing awards in the country, and I'm thrilled to introduce this year's winner, the 2020 winner, which is Eva Crocker, for her book, All I Ask. Congratulations, Eva. I'd also like to introduce one of the finalists, Bridget Canning, for her book called Some People's Children, a wonderful book, and also Andrea Procter for this magnificent work on residential schools in Newfoundland and Labrador from 1900 to about the 1980s. Thank you all for joining us, ladies. Just a quick one more word on the BMO Winterset Award. We can't thank our donors, our sponsors enough. That's the BMO Financial Group, Arts Newfoundland and Labrador, and the foundation established by Richard Gwynn, specifically to celebrate and support Newfoundland and Labrador writers and writing, and to commemorate St. John's social historian Sandra Gwynn, who did so much to promote a national awareness of the arts of this province. So the plan is I'm going to ask our lovely authors to first of all do, I think, an impossible task, and that's to give a brief summary of their books. This is to help the few of you out there who might not have read it, and I know you're only a few, but also those who haven't read the books recently, if they'd be kind enough just to do about a 2-minute summary. I'm going to start with our winner, Eva Crocker, All I Ask. Eva, would you be kind enough? I know it's a difficult thing to do, but just a 2-minute summary of your book.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I started work on this book in 2017 after a group of RNC officers forced entry into my home and told me that I was under arrest for transmission of child pornography, which was actually not the case. They were basing this forced entry on months-old evidence having to do with somebody who had lived in my address long before, who I'd never met. And it was an incident that would have been far more dangerous and traumatic, I think, if I weren't a white cis woman, if English weren't my first language, if I'd had children there with me. But it was still really disturbing. And so the book is a fictionalized account of the aftermath of that incident. The protagonist has had her hard drives and electronics seized, and the police are combing through them and looking for evidence of illegal activity. So it's kind of a reflection on privacy and surveillance and how much of ourselves is really captured in our digital mirror image. But it's also a queer love story. And it's kind of about how empowering it can be to choose to show parts of yourself to people, and also how deeply disturbing it can be to lose control over that.
Thank you, and congratulations. Bridget.
Hi, thank you so much, Jennifer. Okay, so just a little bit, this is my second book published, but this is actually the first novel I've ever written. I was going through some old journals actually, and I found one from 2000, and there's actually sections of the book there. So it's something that I picked up and put down for years and years. And it's basically because it does cover 9 years of the protagonist's life. So some people's children, basically, I would describe it as a coming of age story. It's set in the late 80s and early 90s, and it covers 9 years of the protagonist. Her name's Imogene Tubbs, from her ages 11 to 20. And it starts at the moment that she gets an inkling that what she's been told about who her father is not really what anyone believes. So Imogene is raised in a small rural community based on the west coast of Newfoundland. It's called St. Felix's. She's raised by her grandmother, as her mother had her at quite a young age. Her mother was pregnant when she was 14. And so throughout, her mother's she doesn't really see her mother very much. She's her sporadically, maybe a couple of times a year throughout her childhood and formative years. So at this moment that she finds out that so what she's been told about her father is that he was this kind of, handsome rogue fisherman coming through town, had a fling with her mother, who he didn't realize was so young at the time. But what she realizes that what a lot of her family members and people in her community do not actually believe is that her father is Cecil Gesso, who is the local bootlegger, the local drug dealer, and rather sketchy person who is kind of both reviled and made fun of, who lives up the street. So she, throughout the book, she struggles with basically being, she's basically raised as a product of gossip. It struggles with who she is told that she is and who she feels that she is. And it also kind of talks about, her trying to find her identity in that, and also trying to define her relationship with her mother. And of course, this is all set in the late 80s, early 90s, where things are kind of rooted in misogyny and rape culture. So Imogene does not really have the language or the voice to even know how to start answering questions about this. So within that, there's also lots of terrible teenage mistakes and discoveries and all those things that kind of come with coming of age.
Thank you so much, and we'll have more to chat about that now in a moment. Now, to ask anybody to put that into 2 minutes is an awful challenge, Andrea. And look at that beautiful cover in the back. Andrea Procter, can you just quickly try to tell us what this is all about? It's a marvelous book.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. Yeah, so A Long Journey, I guess, is my attempt to tell a story based on hundreds of other people's stories. And so these are not my stories, but they were given to me to shape into one narrative. The book is a historical account of the 6 residential schools in Labrador and the orphanage in St. Anthony, which were established and run by the Moravian Mission and the International Grenfell Association. Between 1906 and 1980, about 2,000 Indigenous children lived at these institutions. So a few years ago, former boarding school students from Nunatsiavut and Nunatulavut asked me to write a history of these schools based on their experiences and their stories. But I'm non-Indigenous, I'm Haluna, as they say in Inuktitut, and I'm very cognizant of the colonial context that we're in and the real power and potential harm that writing and that storytelling can have when you're narrating history. And going into this, I was also very aware of the impacts of the boarding schools, the impacts that they've had on Inuit families. And so I felt a very deep sense of accountability and responsibility towards them. I knew I had to tell their stories in a way that really reflected and honored their memories. So I relied on a large circle of Indigenous advisors, many of whom were former boarding school students themselves. And we worked on figuring out how exactly to reflect the wide range of perspectives that we heard in our interviews with former boarding school students, as well as in the archival record. So it was a real collaborative labor of love. And it was written with and for and to a very specific audience of Indigenous families in Labrador.
Thank you very much. More of that now in a moment when we get our interviews going. But I think to just put the meat on the bones of what you've just done, I'd love for each of you to do about a 5-minute reading. You can contextualize what you want to read. And I'm going to start again with Eva, if you'd be so kind.
Sure. So I'm just going to read 2 really brief passages. One is from the very opening of the book, and it is a description of this incident that I mentioned earlier. So there's some police content that could be disturbing to people. It's about a minute, if anybody wants to mute it. They took my computer and phone so they could copy the contents. They called it a mirror image. They said it was the fastest way to prove I wasn't the suspect, and also I didn't have a choice. There were nudes. There was a picture taken with the flash of a pimple on the back of my neck, swollen and inflamed. They didn't know when they'd get to it. The unit was really backed up. What was it called? Child pornography, digital something? The unit. He said there were only 3 or 4 guys in the unit for the whole province. There are emails back and forth with my mother, scheduling visits with my grandmother in the hospital. Emails where I say things like, I have kickboxing, but I guess I can go if no one else is available. Lessons are prepaid. There were rejection emails from casting directors. All the stupid things I'd Googled, things I should have known. When did Newfoundland join Canada? What is Brexit? Are most oven dials Fahrenheit or Celsius? How much of that is in the mirror image? Reams of it. These things can take time. Couldn't tell you. A judge in Gander signed the warrant. What were they looking for? Illegal digital material. What does that mean? And what does transmitted mean? Transmitted from my address. Is it the same as seeded? It's different than uploaded. I've seen uploaded in the paper. Footage of a slump-shouldered man with a windbreaker pulled over his head walking into the courtroom. A drawing in the newspaper of some sad sack evil piece of shit sitting beside the judge. Who was combing through my hard drive, picking through the digital traces, footsteps, shadows, taking in all the undeleted drafts, all the weird, unflattering angles. 3 or 4 guys taking their time. And then I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. This scene is the protagonist is thinking back to junior high. The book also talks a lot about roommate relationships. And so she lives with a very close friend and is thinking about the sort of things they would get up to together when they were younger. I thought of when Viv and I were in junior high and we used to play with the payphone in Churchill Square at lunchtime. We'd eat sitting on the curb outside the strip mall and then go in and use the bathroom. The phone was on the bottom floor, tucked behind the stairs next to a travel agency. We would try to guess which 1-800 numbers led to phone sex lines. We found that almost any vaguely dirty combination of a 3-letter word followed by a 4-letter word led to a sex line. 1-800 wet dick, 1-800 hot puss, 1-800 got wood. Me and Viv and sometimes Kyle Patterson would come up with numbers and test them. We'd gather around while one of us dialed, shielding the caller from passersby and watching for the security guard who sometimes came by saying, clear out, clear out. If you're not buying anything, clear out. The slippery silver buttons would clunk back into the phone when you pressed them. 1-800 big tits, reaching out into the void. 1-800 gay girl. If the number you dialed wasn't a sex line, the phone would bark an angry dial tone in your ear. 1-800 sex cock, got one. When you landed a sex line, a pre-recorded message poured out of the receiver. A woman purred a monologue about masturbating, interrupting herself with increasingly stern instructions to enter your credit card number. Every part of the payphone was greasy. The phone's handle, the cup that rests against your ear and chin, the heavy coil that bound the receiver to the phone box, even the graffitied sides of the phone. Just across the tiled hallway from us, middle-aged women would meet for lunch at the bistro-style tables outside living rooms. They broke apart tea buns and used plastic knives to smear butter and strawberry jam from little packets on the doughy insides. Sometimes they looked up when we got rowdy, howling with laughter, shrieking suggestions, wrestling over the receiver. 1-800-HOT-HOMO. We listened for as long as the pre-recorded messages lasted. Sometimes there would be different options to choose from. Girls with accents, young girls, angry girls, gay girls, sometimes gay guys. We cycled through, listening to each performance in full. We huddled shoulder to shoulder next to a rack of pamphlets advertising tropical vacations. We listened to all the free parts of every phone sex line we could find. We stayed tuned into the chorus of panting voices for as long as possible. I'm here, I'm horny, this is what my body looks and feels like, these are things we could do together, pay me. Thank you.
Thank you, my dear. Brought me back memories with the payphone, because it's what Stacey resorts to when she's robbed of her cell and everything. So the good old greasy payphone, a thing of the past. Bridget Canning, please.
Thank you so much. That's a great reading, Eva. Thank you. I'm going to read most of chapter 8 from Some People's Children. So in this section, Imogene's in grade 10. She's in biology class, and I don't know if they still have this lesson in biology class where they do DNA and they talk about like recessive and dominant genes and things like that. But the lesson leads her into thinking about the gossip about Cecil Gesso being her father, and how much more she can figure out about that. And just as a warning, there is one racial slur in the first probably minute I'm going to read, and then at the very end there is a few F-bombs. If anyone needs to just be aware of that, or if you need to bleep them out. In biology class, Mr. Wall puts everyone in groups and has them fill out a survey. How many people in their group have brown eyes, blue eyes? How many have joined earlobes, a widow's peak? Does anyone have pinky fingers that bend towards a ring finger? Can everyone roll their tongues? Imogene is grouped with Crystal Seymour and Quincy McIsaac. They examine each other's foreheads and hands and stick out their tongues at each other. Crystal points out that she has green eyes and it's not on the list. Write it in, Mr. Wall says. The results are tabulated on the board. Most people have brown eyes. It's a dominant gene. Mr. Wall gives it a large letter B. Joined earlobes, straight pinkies, and the ability to roll your tongue are also all dominant. Blue eyes are recessive and represented by a small b. For blue eyes to happen, both people have to have a recessive gene. Both parents, sorry. They do calculations for blue-eyed offspring scenarios. Donnie Martin says most people in the class have brown eyes because they're a bunch of jacketars. Everyone laughs and Mr. Wall gives them a warning. Imogene is in the blue-eye column. Maggie, her mother, has brown eyes, so she must carry a blue-eye gene, which makes sense as Nan has blue eyes. And Imogene's father would have to have blue eyes or brown with a recessive blue-eye gene. Imogene also has crooked pinkies. She doesn't remember what Maggie's hands are like. And red hair is recessive, Mr. Wall says. So is blonde hair and green eyes, Crystal says. Donnie says, sure, you've only been blonde since Miss Clairol came to town. Biology class continues the next day with examples of brown and black cows. Imogene's cousin Rita looks at her book over her shoulder while they're on the bus and rolls her eyes. Genetics, we did that last year. So boring. My parents had brown eyes, so I have brown eyes. Quelle surprise. Imogene regards her cousin next to her on the vinyl bus seat. Rita with her long brown hair, brown eyes, and skin that turns butterscotch in summer. Nan says Rita is true Tubbs, just like her dad, who was just like Pop. Petite too, the Tubbs are short and wiry, little dark Tubbs full of athletic ability and good humor. No one would consider questioning Rita's DNA. And DNA tests cost a lot of money, according to Great Aunt Bride. They do them all the time on TV, but they cost an arm and a leg in real life. When Imogene's off the bus and into the house, Nan tells her to go to the store for butter and brown sugar. I have to make date squares for the Women's Institute tonight, she says. It's so annoying. Imogene has money. She could have got off the bus at the store and walked back. Nan never knows what she needs until she needs it. The wind is like frozen sandpaper, and she fumes for the whole walk to the store. She doesn't even notice whose truck is parked outside the quick stop. Inside the store, Cecil Gesso is at the counter. Imogene's chest gets all tangled and she forces the grimace off her face. His back is hunched in a camouflage hunting jacket, like a sack of potatoes trying to hide. She glances around the store. No other customers in sight. She could get a look at him and check his earlobes and pinky fingers. Loretta Sampson is at the cash and she eyes Imogene walking to the cooler for butter. Frig off, Loretta. Imogene gets a bag of brown sugar and the butter and heads to the cash. She pretends to be interested in a display of plastic beads for making friendship bracelets and watches him from a distance. Cecil buys a pack of smokes, a lotto ticket, and a dozen Black Horse. He takes his change with his left hand. Maybe he is left-handed like her. Is that genetic? It seems like it would be random. When he steps away from the counter, there is a ticking sound on the floor. The plastic tip of his bootlace is loose on the tile. Your shoe's untied, she says. Huh? Your boot's untied. Cecil blinks at her, mouth parted. He bends and yanks the laces up. The pinky finger of his right hand curls in like a subtle comma. She stares at the dangling pinky. She coaxes her lip not to shrivel up in disgust. She could kick him right now, a boot to his stupid orange head. Or in a second, when he puts his hand down for balance, she could step forward. His fingernails crunching like snail shells under her foot. This is for my mother, she say, you fucking prick. Tanks, he says. Cecil picks up the box of beer by one handle. The door jangles shut behind him. His pack of Player's Light is forgotten on the floor. Imogene pockets it while Loretta rings her in. On the walk home, she climbs under Butterbrook Bridge and stands in the culvert to be sheltered from the wind. She lights a cigarette with a match. A vehicle passes above. Maybe it's Cecil returning to the quick stop for smokes. Well, fuck you, Cece, they're gone now. She takes a puff and swallows it, and then lets one in with a shallow breath. Fuck that piece of garbage and his smokes and his ginger head and his stupid mouth. Fuck that fucking guy. Thank you.
I love, Bridget, how Imogene talks to herself. You know, you get this whole other, we'll talk about that later when it comes to style of writing. But it's lovely how we got right inside her head. She's so many funny things to say, plus very serious ones. Andrea Procter, my dear, what have you chosen to read?
So I chose a section from the Nain boarding school in here because it illustrates something that I really was trying to convey through the book. So when we talk to school survivors, they often describe difficult times, the pain that they had experienced at the boarding schools, but they often did not see themselves as merely victims. They didn't tell their stories as stories of victimhood. They see themselves as independent, as able leaders in their communities who very often stood up to colonial authority figures and asserted their own autonomy in challenging the system and in changing the boarding schools and the educational system. So that's reflected in many parts of the book, including in this section. So this is from, as I said, the Nain boarding school, which was run by the Moravian Mission. And the Moravian missionaries had actually been providing day school to Inuit students since the 1770s. It was only in the 1920s when the economic situation changed suddenly. And so Inuit families needed to be out on the land trapping during the winter season. So their children were no longer going to school. So that was the reason, the impetus for the boarding school in Nain. So, and at first when it opened, it was just for the children of families who were away on the land, but in the 1930s and 1940s, that changed somewhat. In the late 1930s and early 1940s, the Nain missionaries used their authority to pressure parents into leaving their children at the boarding school, even when the families stayed in the village. Children were allowed to visit their families only on Sundays for a few hours after church. The mission could not force children to stay at the school, but it could support parents who obeyed its wishes and sanction those who did not. As one man said in describing why families agreed to send their children to the boarding school, "In them days, you agreed with the missionary." The new practice of boarding all students gave the mission even more control over the children's development. Julius Ikusic was one of the children who stayed at the boarding school while his family lived in Nain. Speaking through his interpreter, he described having to live at the school. Since he was 5 or 6 years old, he stayed over to the boarding school. Up until 13 years old, he was in school. Even though his parents were in Nain, he had to stay in the boarding school from October to March. Sundays, after church service, he used to visit his parents, but he had to be back at 12 to boarding school. Tabia Murphy likewise stayed at the boarding school, although her parents lived in Nain. And she said that was all students, all children, anyone that was 6 years till 13. We only used to go and visit our families every Sunday, once a week, 2 to 4 in the afternoon on Sunday, only time we'd see our family. A woman who worked at the boarding school in the 1940s also recalls the rigid supervision with which the missionaries and teachers ruled the lives of both the children and the local workers. She said, "The place was a prison to me. I never worked so hard in my life. Kate Hetash, who was the teacher, used to eat her meals at the minister's house, and when she went, she'd lock us in. I don't know what we would have done if there had been a fire, try to get out a window, I guess. We had 1 hour a week free to go out. We could only visit with relatives, and if there were any outside the family males that were in the house, we couldn't go in. And if they came in while we were there, we had to leave. One day on the way to church, Jimmy, who wasn't married to my sister yet, said hello to me, and I said hello back to him. I had to stay in for 2 weeks for that. I blamed it all on Kate. She treated me worse than Dad would treat a dog." Tabia Murphy attributes most of her hardships at the school to the strictness of the Hetash missionary family. But her stories also show that Inuit, in this case her grandfather, could challenge the missionaries' control and assert their independence. She said, "We went home on the first Sunday of Advent. This day was chosen by the church committee of church elders, so Inuit elders on the church committee. I was so happy to see an Advent calendar and my Advent stocking with presents hanging on the nail. My mom was cooking partridge for supper. I thought to myself, if only I could stay home for supper like I used to. I could have some Advent supper with my family. Before too long, the girls came in to pick me up. I said, no, I want to eat at home. They just tried to get me dressed and put my hat on and mitts on me. I cried and fought. My grandfather said, let her stay. She can go back to school tomorrow morning. So they left without me. Nothing Kate Hetash, the school teacher, could do, for my grandfather was on the church committee.
Thank you, my dear. And we're going to come around to more individual interviews in a moment, or dialogue rather. When reading your 3 books, I saw a consistent theme in attaching various forms of survival within various forms of culture. For instance, Bridget, you had 2 forms of culture, small rural community, gossip-laden small rural community, to the more active urban environment where Imogene bathed in anonymity. And she survived all this despite being haunted by her conception, her perceived conception. So how did you juggle those elements of those 2 different cultures and her pursuit for survival? And I'm asking the other 2 of you similar type of question.
That's a great question. Wow. It's actually interesting you bring that up, because I think part of the thing that part of the reason why what keeps Imogene going is the idea of escape. When she is young, and because she is just kind of living, it's just her and her grandmother living together. So she ends up being that type of child that gets sent away. So she gets sent to Ontario, she gets sent to St. John's. So she kind of at a young age gets these kind of little tastes like, oh, this is what it's like to live somewhere where people don't know everything about you and don't think that they have their mind made up about you right away. So that kind of, I think what keeps her going through high school is that idea that, so she studies, she works hard, she does well, all with this kind of end goal that I am going to leave. And when I leave, I am going to be the person that I want to be. When she then finally, this happens and she's a university student, I think then there's more, like the more layers of what's kind of been keeping her down. The fact that there's not a lot of people in her family that have a university background. So she's one of the first people. They don't seem to understand what she's going through. Being from rural Newfoundland, being a bayman in town, and people just don't take you seriously. You can't it's hard to get a job because of nepotism and because of just not having the same type of work experience. Feeling like even going into, so the layers of like, she just hasn't had a lot of experience, the same type of experience, the same type of education as her classmates and the people around her. So suddenly feeling the effects of being from a lower income, being from a rural area, having a different accent, things like that suddenly also becomes something that even though she's finally anonymous, she's still kind of carrying that stigma, or what she feels to be a type of stigma around with her. So I mean, how she kind of deals with that in town is she kind of X out new friendships and things like that with people, and finally kind of having those first friendships that feel very meaningful, where someone's knowing you more as the type of person that you see yourself as being. So I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Yes, it
but
does.
yeah.
And it leads nicely into my asking Eva essentially the same kind of question. In some way, there was a comparison between Stacey and Imogene, except for Stacey, I think, was still searching for self-survival a lot, I felt, all the way through. And she had to find herself first. And when she finally did with Vivian, I think we saw a new Stacey, Eva, if you agree. But your culture was a relatively dense urban downtown culture, which you captured so expertly. Even that lady, the coughing lady opposite the door, was watching Stacey all the time. I felt you almost had her position herself as we, the readers, were just watching Stacey go through these transitions and these horrible times with the police but within that dense downtown culture. So how do you compare her survival and her culture along the same lines as I asked Bridget Canning?
Thank you for that. I wanted to write about this really specific moment in St. John's, and not just in St. John's, in all over Newfoundland and Labrador, I think, where in 2017 there was a lot of kind of social unrest around a number of different issues. There was Indigenous-led resistance to the Muskrat Falls Dam. There were protests surrounding the Snellgrove trial. There were these huge rallies about the Liberal austerity budget, and it was like a very dark time, but it was also a time of people coming together and speaking out. And I was trying to sort of capture the feeling at that time in the city.
Now, Andrea, your cultures, I see three. You're talking about the culture in Labrador essentially being quote unquote modernized. Then there was a separate culture within the boarding schools themselves that was an internal culture. And then, of course, there's the culture that these children came from, which had different values, different sense of discipline. And how on earth could those children survive with all those clashes going on? It was a real feat to survive.
Yeah, it was. And I mean, that is the basis of what the boarding schools were designed for. They were designed to change the children's culture. They were based on the assumption that there was something inherently wrong with Indigenous children, with Indigenous child rearing, with Indigenous education. And so they were meant, and the people who ran them were very often very open about their motives and their intentions to take the children away from the influence of their families and their communities and put them in these institutions, and then somehow transform them into and improve them somehow. And so yeah, the children dealt with that in many ways. But they often retained a lot of their language in the schools where Inuktitut was not really encouraged. You hear stories of children, going out and swinging on the swings in the dorm and talking Inuktitut to each other to keep up their language, to sending letters back and forth to their parents to keep up their language. And really, in the end, too, in a number of the schools, the families and the communities said, this is not the situation that we want. We don't want to have to send our children away. This is not the education we want for them. We're going to open schools in our own communities and close down the boarding schools. And so they did. In 3 cases, the students and the communities decided enough was enough, and they closed down the boarding schools. So that, for me, is a huge story of strength and Indigenous leadership and sovereignty.
Yes. Yes, and I guess the interesting thing is sort of ironic that today's political leaders, as referenced in your book, in Labrador, many of them are from these residential schools. So it's kind of a full circle that they gained their ability to be leaders and from what form of education they had, but it sort of has come full circle.
Well, and it was never the education that was the issue. The families and children did want an education. It's not like they didn't want education at all. They just wanted it on their own terms and developed in their own ways.
I felt reading all 3 books, there was a sense of being trapped and lonely, and that's sort of obvious with the schools. But I also, Eva Crocker, felt when Stacey had the dog bite her hand, and then she went home after the theater, and she said she felt deeply lonely, but yet she was surrounded by friends, surrounded by people. She always seemed to be busy with people, but yet I felt that she was sad and trapped in a cycle that she couldn't break out of. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that having this experience of being harassed by the police felt very isolating for her, for, just logistical reasons of not having access to communication in the way that she normally did, but also just trying to deal with the bureaucracy of that system can feel very isolating. And so that's part of what's going on. And it also, the stress of it causes her to, impact her interpersonal relationships and makes it difficult for her to kind of like regulate her emotions in the way that she normally would. And it's so frustrating to see that you're not going to have any sort of recourse or justice, and that can cause a sort of amorphous anger that leaks out.
Okay, my dear. Now, there was no talking about trapped and lonely Andrea Procter in the school for these children. I was very moved by a story that was portrayed by Tony Obed about how they denied him access to his mother. And I was wondering if you'd be kind enough just to share that again briefly, if you could be so kind.
Yeah, so Toby Obed was and continues to be really one of the spokespeople in Labrador about the boarding schools. So so for years, the story of the Labrador boarding schools was not being shared. It was not seen as the equivalent of the Canadian boarding schools. And Toby was really one of the leaders to change that. And he had a really horrendous experience himself. So his family was relocated originally from Northern Labrador, so forced relocation to the southern or to Nunavut communities from the north.
He was only three years old, wasn't he?
Well, he was 3 years old when he was taken by social services away from his family. And placed in the the infants home, as it was called in Northwest River. And then he lived there until he aged out, until he was in his teenager. And he, so yeah, in the book, he talks about the time when his mother came to Northwest River, where he was, to have his brother, and Toby was only allowed half an hour to talk with her. And yeah, he describes his heartbreak of that. You know, he's been separated from his family, he's been denied access to them, and yeah, he of all the former boarding school students, I think has suffered as much as anybody.
I want to go to Bridget Canning now, and back to Imogen and her enormous sense of self-loathing because of her perceived conception. I'll just read quickly how it's described here. Who is Imogen to her anyway? Her meaning her mother. As she says, some foreign thing that invaded her body before she knew her body at all. The creature from the swamp past of mistakes in judgment. The secret monster from the dark pit of the wrong place, wrong time. And later she says, Imogen, the silent alien, or the Tony Green monster, which was the man whose name was on her birth certificate, or the creature from the rapist lagoon. I mean, how deep was her self-loathing, Bridget Canning?
Well, very deep, obviously. I think it's, well, we were talking about loneliness before, and Imogen has really no one to talk about this with her. She has, conversations with, even when she's talking to her mother on the phone, there's always someone in the background. It's that, it's the late 80s. We all had, do we even have cordless phones? So you couldn't even go into another room. So even when she's talking to her mother's common law boyfriend is standing within earshot. Her grandmother's standing in earshot. So Imogen is so full of questions, and of course, her mother, I think throughout the book it's obvious her mother does not feel that way and adores her, loves her very much. But when you have that kind of relationship, it's like, what was this? There was a term I read the other day, love bomb, and it was talking about like really toxic relationships where you have someone does these huge buys you lots of presents and shows these big moments of devotion. And that's not what Maggie does with Imogen, Maggie being Imogen's mother. But because they don't see each other often, the only way she can really show love is through, over the phone and sending gifts in the mail and arriving with like tokens and tokens and tokens of affection. And in some ways, for Imogen, I think it just makes her loathe herself even more. It's like, because it's not, it's so kind of devoid of meaning. So with that, I think she has there's so much self-loathing. And of course, throughout the book, this is even before she starts getting bullied quite a bit. So it's, that kind of, I think when you feel that way, when we are feeling so kind of, we don't have a good perception when things do happen to us, like we are victimized, it just feels like we're almost giving off pheromones for it, where people can sense how much we don't love each other ourselves. So yeah, I think that was really, like, what you read there is really at the beginning of the book, and that's kind of what I wanted to show throughout it, that she, despite all of this, learns how to, I don't know how much she loves herself at the end of the book, but I think she's at a point where she knows herself and has managed to also know her mother. I think that's part of where the self-loathing comes from, is these two people don't know each other. They love each other, but they don't know each other. So those types of things that are fundamental in that kind of familiar relationship, where you can be something supportive and be the type, be people who can, make ourselves love ourselves. I think near the end of the book, that's hopefully that's established. But yeah, I think, yeah, that is kind of what I want. It's also, you know, she's, I think, 12, and a lot of her self-loathing is very colored with, you know, teenage, you know, deep teenage emotion that is genuine, but
And getting
so go ahead.
bullied about it all, and getting bullied about it didn't help. And I've just got one more question for you, Bridget Canning, on the venom of gossip in a small community. Kelly, which is Maggie's friend, says people got no idea what poison their mouths can do. So gossip is a horrid and useless phenomenon, as I said earlier. It's really quite a wretched thing, isn't it? As particularly as it affected Imogene.
In this circumstance, yes, but I also think gossip is natural. I think people tend to like when we think about the way language has developed. I don't know if you've ever read the book Sapiens. There's a lot of talk about gossip and that, because that's how people, you know, you can't trust this person. You can't, like, that's how, you know, people talked about each other, how to survive. But there's also that kind of, especially in such a small, when you're in a small place, everyone knows each other. It was always something that struck me growing, because I grew up in a rural place. There was that kind of moment when the adult conversations kind of bleed into childhood play and teenage play, which I have distinct memories of, you know, kids arguing and then someone throwing out something that like that their parents said, and suddenly the entire tone of everything changes. So in this circumstance for Imogene, yes, it is. But I also think that sometimes it is kind of natural to us that we talk about each other and try to figure each other out. I think sometimes gossiping is kind of a way that people try to figure out motivations and behaviors and things like that. So I don't know. In this context, unfortunately, it is, yeah.
I want to shift back to Andrea Procter. I'd also like to hear your thoughts or your observations on how different the Labrador residential school system is from the rest of Canada. There are distinct differences, aren't there?
Yeah, there are differences, and I think it's important to understand both the differences and the similarities, though. So the main difference, though, is that the schools here were not run and administered under the Indian Act. So I mean, we only joined Canada in 1949. So before that, the Indian Act didn't apply. And then even after 1949, it didn't apply. So the schools in Labrador are not part of this network of Indian residential schools that we are hearing so much about in the news these days. So, but in saying that, as I said, their impact, I mean, their intention, the intent behind the schools, the intent to transform Indigenous children and to take them away from their families, that is the same. And the experiences of children was the same across Canada.
I always like to hear stories from individual authors about what their writing routine is. It's always very amusing to see how they vary. You know, some people at the kitchen table, some people for a month and then they stop. So I'm going to ask you first, Eva Crocker, what's your writing routine?
I feel like it's really changed since the pandemic. So I used to always like to try to be outside of the house somewhere at the library or a cafe or something, but I've gotten used to writing here in my bedroom and usually very early in the morning.
That's wonderful. Bridget, what's your writing routine?
Again, the pandemic has really affected it. It was really, I found it very frustrating last year, just feeling like you just take it for granted that you can, you know, yeah, as Eva was saying, go to the library or go even sit in a park and make some notes or something like that. Because of course last year, like I don't think we could go to Bannerman Park until May last year, or most of the parks. Right now I'm a morning person. That's usually when I'm most focused. So I wake up and I will try to write kind of right away, like while, you know, my coffee's getting, you know, my coffee's being made. I'll either write right away or I'll take a walk first and then come back and write. I'm trying to get my routine a bit more you know, there where like in the afternoon or in the evening I can but as I said, like I feel like I know that my energy and my focus is so much better in the morning, so I tend to do most of it then, and then the rest day is a struggle. Pretty much that's my routine, just struggling. Trying to get everything done.
Now, Andrea Procter, before I ask you your writing style, which is more academic and documented, I do have to hear how Confederation affected the schools. If you could be really brief on that. It's just so interesting how much that impacted on recruiting and education policies and everything.
Yeah, so it affected them in a number of ways. As I said, after Confederation, the provincial government really did take over more control of the education system. So the curriculum changed in that way. But like the impact of the family allowance, though, actually this new money going to families had a huge influence, and especially on like the orphanage in St. Anthony. All of a sudden the numbers of children who were taken in there went down dramatically. So but you can see in the northern Inuit communities in Nunatsiavut, when the provincial government, like after Confederation, this new government started really taking over governance of the communities. And so Inuit, who had been quite active politically, started to lose some control over some of the authority they had in the community. So that impacted the boarding schools as well.
Plus, there was a threat to lose your family allowance. Am I not correct? If you didn't go
Right.
into the system, that's
Yes.
pretty powerful.
Yeah. And so before that time, going to school was really a voluntary thing in general. I mean, there was a law passed in 1942 that you had to go to school, but that wasn't really enforced very well. And the only real enforcement came with the family allowance, so that the people, families could lose their family allowance if they didn't send their children to school. So yeah,
interesting consequence. Now you wrote for a particular project, so I would imagine your focus for writing was a bit different than Eva Crocker's and Bridget Canning's. Am I correct?
Yes, I don't really actually see myself as a writer. I see myself as a researcher, and writing is something that I do. I'm not on the same level as these guys in terms of writing.
No, you're on a wonderful level, just a different kind of level.
Different kind.
So talking to Eva Crocker and Bridget Canning, I was interested to compare your writing styles. Eva, I found, and I thought you were very brave to do it, because your sentences are short and tight, but I didn't have a sense of it being clipped. You could describe things, but you did it with such a flow that it was continually captivating. And I would think that'd be a difficult way to write, because you don't go on with adjectives and adverbs and smells and everything. You just are very specific about what you see and want to share. I would think that'd be a bit of a challenge.
Thank you for that, Jennifer. Yeah, I feel like the voice is obviously something you shape a lot in the editing, but it also, I think, just kind of comes out, for me anyway, when you're writing, and it's not so much a choice whether it's going to be kind of very descriptive or more of a sort of like a clean style that I was trying to like emulate, both of which I admire. But it's a partly, I feel like, just the voice that's happening in my head, and then trying to refine that in the editing process.
Yeah, the trick I think with you is it was clean, but it wasn't sterile, if you get my drift. But talking about in your head, what I loved about Bridget Canning was everything she said to herself in her head. And I'm thinking, thank God people can't hear what's in my head. I wouldn't have a friend left. But I loved how she talked to herself and how you use that other voice to just round out the experience.
Thank you.
Tell us why you did that voice. Yeah.
It's also like a third person voice. So what I wanted to do there was to kind of have the immediacy of how she's kind of, the narration is going on in her head, but also be able to put her very much in the place, and also an awareness of, a strong awareness of the other characters in the story. So, which I think that kind of when the point of view is usually what I kind of think about a lot. Like the voice is something, as Eva says, like it tends, you develop it and you continue to work on it. And I also tend to be an overwriter. I just write everything and then kind of kill my darlings.
Yeah, yeah.
And then try to get it down so that it's like to be as concise as it can. So it's always kind of important for me to have the sense of kind of the internal in the immediacy of the external. So I guess as I said, I usually use, like, for that point of view is one of the things I like about that. That the third person point of view, as I mentioned.
It was a good tool to use. Moving forward, Andrea Procter, what's next for you?
So I'm working with Nunatuavut to develop educational materials. There's this, as this is not really a book that you would have in schools or in junior schools anyway. So we're working on making school curriculum materials. The Nunatsiavut government and Nunatuavut are doing all kinds of healing efforts and educational efforts around the boarding schools. So I'm taking their lead on where that is. And in terms of the impact of the book, I think I've heard a lot of people, in Labrador say, "Oh, I learned this about my family. I didn't know my grandmother, blah, blah, blah." So it was, I think it's made people feel connected with each other and more understanding the larger impact of all of the schools put all together, the Moravian schools and the IGA schools. So
thank you very much for what you've done, and good luck with the curriculum. Bridget Canning, next moves in your writing career?
I'm working on my first novel, The Greatest Hits of Wine and Janes, is being adapted to film, so we're kind of waiting to see what happens with that. I've written the script for that, so we're just kind of keeping our fingers crossed for funding and things like that. So my next writing project is, I guess I can say it because I have it's not really official yet, but hopefully in August this will be official. Breakwater is going to be publishing my short story collection, which is currently titled No One Knows About Us, which Eva gave me Eva worked with me doing a manuscript evaluation last year, and it was extremely helpful. Thank you, Eva. Looks like it's going to happen. So that's the current, and I'm working on a couple other small projects that hopefully will also come to fruition.
Good luck with that, and congratulations on the movie as well. So Eva Crocker, our BMO 1920 award winner, Winterset Award winner, what's your next plan? Or what are you working on now? Well,
first I just wanted to say what an honor it was to be on the list with Andrea and Bridget, and I'm so excited about both of your projects. And as Bridget was saying, I got to read a draft of the short stories, and it's incredible. It's such a great book, so I'm really excited about that. I'm working on a new novel, but it's kind of early days and it keeps shifting. And I'm also doing a PhD in Concordia, researching art, visual art from Newfoundland, and I'm working on a non-fiction book about that.
Oh, you're a very busy woman. Congratulations. I want to thank all three of you for joining us today virtually, and maybe we'll see you again at Winterset and Summer Festival in Eastport in the middle of August. Keep our fingers crossed.